ahead and get started because it's noon-ish. All right. This is Dr. Amanda Jansen. Dr. Jansen is an associate professor in the School of Education at the University of Delaware, where she's currently on sabbatical for the rest of this year.
Yes.
And she earned her PhD in educational psychology from Michigan State University. And prior to graduate school, she taught middle school mathematics in Mesa, Arizona for 3 years. We should all be familiar with her book, Motivation Matters and Interest Counts, Fostering Engagement in Mathematics, which she co-wrote with Jim Middleton at Arizona State University in 2011. Her research has also been published in various journals, such as Mathematical Thinking and Learning, Educational Studies in Mathematics, the Elementary School Journal, JRME, and Journal of Mathematics Teacher Education, and the Middle Grades Research Journal. She was awarded this year, in 2014, she was awarded by the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educator with an Outstanding Early Career Mathematics Educator Award. And in 2009, she won AERA's Special Interest Group for Research in Mathematics Education Award for Excellence in Early Career Publication. And she's here today to give a talk entitled How Are Students Constructed in Research on Mathematics Curriculum. So please welcome Dr. Amanda Jansen.
Thanks, Amber. So my adventure getting here from Delaware was less monumental than Amber's multi-day adventure returning from the East Coast. So I appreciate that you had great weather here yesterday. So thanks for having me. The talk I'm giving today, it's based on a review of literature, a review of a subset of literature in mathematics education. And I'm going to gradually get into aspects of this title, like what do I mean by constructions of students, and why does this matter anyway? And what do I mean by research on curriculum? And I'll also share my own personal interest in this subset of research. But before I begin getting into all that, let's just start by, we're going to imagine that we're virtually opening the table of contents of JRME in some recent journals issues, and we'll see some articles that appear in there. So this is from November of 2013. This is a sample title, A Multi-Institutional Study of High School Mathematics Curricula and College Mathematics Achievement and Course Taking. Note the effects of curriculum on student achievement. Looking at July of 2013, here's a title. The effects of content organization and curriculum implementation on students' mathematics learning in second-year high school courses. Again, the effects of curriculum on students' learning. If we look at May 2013, we can see the impact of challenging geometry and measurement units on the achievement of grade 2 students. So I'm sharing this to say that in many issues of this journal, it's not difficult to find examples of studies in which students are represented in research on curriculum in the form of test scores. So alternatively, we could imagine students playing a role in the relationship between curriculum and students learning in different ways. One classic example comes up in research on cognitive demand. Students are written about as potentially playing a role in lowering cognitive demand by asking certain questions, and then the teacher succumbs to some pressure, perhaps to over-scaffold and lower the challenge of the tasks in response to the students. So in that way, the students could play a role in shaping and changing what they have opportunities to learn. We could also imagine that students could play a role in raising cognitive demand by asking more challenging questions and wonderments and seeking new connections that may not have been in play in the task as designed. So students could actually play a role in transforming the nature of what they learn as well. So I want to think about how students could be represented and constructed in research on curriculum. So what do we mean by research on curriculum in math education anyway? So research in this subset of literature covers a range of territory. I just gave some examples about studies of the relationship between curriculum and students' learning. And the goals of these studies are to really investigate whether new curriculum materials either do no harm or provide potentially better opportunities for students to learn particular content, of course, also depending on how they're implemented. There are also research studies on how teachers use particular curriculum materials. They address issues like the fidelity of implementation of materials, how teachers adapt and use the materials to meet the needs of their students, how teachers' knowledge and beliefs mediate how they use the materials in terms of what content is covered, what problems they teach, how they conduct their lessons. So this is a flavor of research in this subset. Design-based research takes into account students' thinking as researchers design and modify and change particular tasks and make decisions about how tasks are sequenced. And there are studies that involve interviewing students and trying to understand how they respond to particular tasks. And these have implications for curriculum studies because often goals for what students should learn are refined based on studies of students' thinking. So these are some flavors of research in curriculum. So what do I mean by curriculum anyway? So curriculum is what students can or do learn. And I examine constructions of students in this subfield of research of mathematics curriculum because it is inherently concerned with students. If I was to think about students and how they're represented and constructed, curriculum is a good choice because ultimately these sorts of studies are concerned with students and what they learn. And this quote is taken from a handbook chapter in our second handbook of research on teaching and learning. And this is a definition of curriculum: the substance and content of teaching and learning, the what of teaching and learning, as distinguished from the how of teaching. In this handbook chapter, less than a page is presented about students' roles in the process of how curriculum unfolds in the classroom. The classic example of students lowering cognitive demand is one of those examples. Another is how teachers may read their students in the moment in different ways based on their beliefs and expectations about them and so forth. But I believe there's more to be understood about students' roles in the process of how curriculum unfolds in the classroom as well. There's consensus in the field of mathematics education, however, that curriculum is not static. So this diagram may be pretty familiar to some of you. Versions of this diagram represents phases of how curriculum can evolve. So if we start with the written curriculum, what's written down could be in textbooks, it could be curriculum guides, it could be standards documents, but written statements of what students should learn. Also interacts with intended curriculum, which is authors' intentions of what students could or do learn. And this would be based on either images of students or data about students' thinking. So that's a way students could play a role. Enacted and implemented curriculum. So enacted might be teachers' planned lessons, and implemented would be the in-the-moment teachers and students interacting. And so this is another place where transformation of what students could have opportunities to learn could happen based on the images that teachers have of students, data that they have about how their students think, that affects how they plan, and then those in-the-moment interactions, what students have opportunities to learn could be transformed. Then we have what people might call the received curriculum, which is a combination of learned and hidden curriculum, where students are really looked at the end of the process. So learned could be anything like mathematics content, like concepts, skills, ways of reasoning, ways of thinking, ways of seeing. But there's also hidden curriculum, sometimes subtle other messages like who is capable of doing mathematics at all? Is ability fixed or is it malleable? Is everyone capable of coming to know and do mathematics, or are there messages communicated that some people are math people and others are not? So there are lots of aspects of received curriculum that can be taken away, but the point here is if students are captured at the end, they're more of outcomes. And if students are characterized in the research study as a part of written curriculum, it's more in curriculum design, especially if they're looked at as part of the cycle that ends up in written curriculum. And students could also be involved in the process of curriculum use if students are characterized as playing a role in the moment of teachers planning or implementing lessons. So design research suggests this cyclical process where choices that are made about how curriculum is written and implemented could be informed by students. So I want to present a range of ways that students have been and could be constructed in this area of research, but before I say what I mean by that, I want to share a little bit more about my history with research on curriculum so you can understand my standpoint and what I'm looking at and thinking about when I read these research studies. So I've done a range of studies that account for student voice. A subset of my research on student voice has also taken into account curriculum. So for years, I was involved in a study called the Mathematical Transitions Project. I'll say a little bit about that briefly, but it's looking at how students make sense out of different experiences with curriculum. for example, if you were in middle school and you experienced what some might call reform, which is not really descriptive, maybe something like Connected Mathematics Project, NSF-funded curriculum materials that are integrated, lots of story problems, it's not topic-based, it's often implemented where students are working in small groups and they are working in groups before the discussion about how to solve the problem happens. And then they move into a high school that is more topical, where the problems look more procedural and the instruction was more teacher lecture at the beginning of the lesson. If the students have a range of experiences with curriculum instruction over time, how do they make sense of that? As teachers and as researchers, we see these experiences as very different. So I spent 2.5 years interviewing students to see if they thought anything was different at all, and if they thought anything was different, what did they think about it, and how did they make sense out of that, and what choices did they make as learners? So that's a different way of accounting for students as outcomes. And I value listening to students' voices about their experiences because I believe that we have something to learn from how students experience life in school. Also, I have engaged in design-based work to improve elementary mathematics teacher education courses as part of my role on the faculty at the University of Delaware. So we spend time studying our pre-service teachers, thinking about mathematics and about pedagogy, and then we use that information to refine our courses so that they're more targeted toward our students' thinking. So that's another way that I'm involved in research on curriculum, but it's curriculum at the teacher education level rather than K-12. So I went into an analysis of research literature about curriculum with a conjecture that students were being overwhelmingly constructed as outcomes, test scores, at the end of curriculum implementation. But I held a standpoint that students could be accounted for more in the process of curriculum use and could be represented in other ways, such as through their voices and then informing stages of design in ways that I wasn't sure that they were involved in yet. So I wanted to test this conjecture by looking more systematically at research. So I'm going to get into details now about my process of how I reviewed the literature. First of all, what do I mean by representations of students? Because I looked at how students were represented, and then I'll talk about what I mean by constructions of students. So representations of students, that's what kind of data do researchers collect about students, and how do they present this data? So when I write up my data, I also talk about it in particular ways. Then there are constructions that follow from that. So these are more subtle. This implications that follow from research design decisions and interpretations of the data, and it could be explicit or implicit in your writing, and it could be intentional or unintentional. So my specific examples will make this more clear. But there's a contrast between what data I present and then how I write about the data that I have. So these are some questions that guided this work. When we represent and account for students in research on math curriculum, what are we able to see and not see about their experiences? And how do these choices illuminate or not the relationship between curriculum and student learning? So one reason to conduct this work is if we want to understand how curriculum influences student learning, understanding students' role in that process could shed more insight. So ultimately, I'm looking at how are students represented and constructed in this domain of research, and then what are the implications of these constructions? So I looked at articles from 1990 to the present. I chose 1990 because the NCTM standards for curriculum and evaluation came out in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and so it seemed like a good starting point when research would appear from that era. And I used a major subject delimiter of curriculum in 2 databases, ERIC and PsycInfo, and I focused on these journals because they're considered to be top journals in our field. So this resulted in 93 articles, and this also resulted after I removed any pieces that were not research studies. So I cut out any book reviews, any editorials, any statements of error, and so I'm ending up with 93 articles. And so for every research article, first I looked at the goals of each study. And there are a range of goals that were similar to the diagram I represented. So looking at students as outcomes, evaluating the efficacy of curriculum materials, looking at curriculum design issues, so anything from what goals should we have for our students' learning to how should we design tasks and instruction and how should we design assessments, and then studies of how teachers use curriculum materials in the classroom. So next I looked at whether students were represented indirectly or directly. So this is a good body of work to look at because all studies of curriculum address students in some way, but they don't always have data about students. So they may talk about students, but I'm focusing more on when there's data of students where students are represented directly. And by that I mean either in terms of quantitative data like achievement scores, but it could also be survey scores that are dispositional. Qualitative data of mathematical thinking or qualitative data of students' voices. That's not just about doing math. So once we look at, out of the 93 articles which represented students directly, we're left with 64 articles, so almost 70% of the articles did represent students directly. So among the articles that represented students directly, I examined how students were constructed. So I will give you an overview. I developed through this analysis 4 dimensions of how students would be constructed, and I'm going to unpack those now in more detail. So as an overview, one dimension is outcome versus process, and I've highlighted that a bit already. Another is static to dynamic, generalized to contextualized, passive to active. So this was the process I used for each article. I took the article and I looked at what is the goal of each study, were students represented directly or indirectly? And if they were represented directly, then how were students constructed, each of these 4? So some studies represented students in terms of outcomes, some in terms of process, or within one study it could be both. So in this case, they could get one of 3 possible codes, outcome or process or outcome and process. And then I conducted reliability analysis between myself and another doctoral student who had recently taken a course on research and theory and curriculum and mathematics. And we did our reliability analyses in rounds of 10. So we would each code 10 articles, come back, meet, and then see how much we disagreed, resolve the disagreements, refined the definitions, go for another 10. So in all, we did 30 articles for reliability, and then after we had refined definitions, I recoded the rest of the articles. So this code, you can see reliability scores at the bottom for each. So outcome and process. So the outcome studies were the ones where they had the goal of looking at the efficacy of the curriculum materials, and process studies were either about design or curriculum use, or they could be both outcome and process studies. So something that would be both would be a study about efficacy that also accounted for how the teachers use the materials, as an example. Another construction of students, static or dynamic. So this is how many points in time we could see students. Static would be a single point of time. Dynamic would be multiple. And so dynamic would be, it could be multiple like pre and post, and we could see the gain scores. Or it could be looking at a unit over time and how the teacher and the students interacted about the mathematics, for instance. Another construction is generalized or contextualized. A generalized construction of a student would be, we don't have very much access to who the participants are, about their histories and contexts where they live, and who they are as people. Instead, we might get information about the broader population or about the school, but we don't get to learn that much about the participants themselves within that context. But a contextualized construction of students would be when we do get access to who the participants are, not just information about the sites of the population. So we see sometimes where we're saying, oh, the population breakdown in the school is like this, but we don't get to know how the participants align with that breakdown, for instance. And when we have quantitative data, we see it sometimes disaggregated. So that's an effort to be a little bit more than looking at students as a generalized student. Another construction, passive versus active. So passive constructions of students is when the students were represented in the article as data to be drawn upon by researchers, in contrast to active constructions of students. That's when agency is attributed more to students. For instance, in studies of curriculum use, if a teacher is drawing upon students and interacting with them, and then what students have opportunities to learn could be transformed, students have agency in that representation and construction. And then when students are represented in terms of their voices, having a say in evaluating materials, for instance, then they have more agency in how they're being constructed. So again, this is the process I use for each article, and these constructions are only applied if students were represented directly, but every study was analyzed in terms of its goal. So one of the contributions I'm intending to make in this work is identifying what the dimensions of constructions could be in the first place. So those came from me. Originally, when I started doing this work, this is a lit review that I've been revisiting over time. And originally, this work was just at the level of outcome and various processes. And so over time, developing more ways that students could be and have been constructed, that's what I'm trying to contribute, ways of thinking about, ways of seeing students. And I'm going to tell you about a fifth dimension of construction of students that I'm bringing to the analysis at the end of the talk. So I'm really trying to say that that's the contribution, is the naming of the ways students can be constructed. But it's useful to look at how prevalent the constructions are and the ways in which they play out in articles. So next I'm going to show you 4 different examples of research articles just to give you an example of ways that students have been constructed in each of them. And then we'll talk about the prevalence across the data sample I looked at with the articles. So this article is an efficacy study. UCSMP, University of Chicago School Mathematics Project, classrooms were contrasted with, they just called a second-year algebra text. I'm not sure what it was. There were matched pairs of classrooms, and the matched pairs were based on a pretest. And they contrasted the UCSMP students with a second-year algebra test. And the students were represented in terms of quantitative test scores. And so students were outcomes. And the UCSMP students generally outperformed the second-year algebra students in the other textbook on multi-step problems and problems involving applications or graphical representations. And then they performed equally well or comparably well on tests that looked for algebraic skills. So this was, in a way, a do no harm study. UCSMP did no harm in terms of the skills assessment, and UCSMP students did generally better on other measurements of their learning. So it was considered static because it was post-test scores rather than gain scores or other change over time. There was a contextualized construction of students because the schools, there were 4 different schools represented, and it was a range of types of schools, and the data was disaggregated by types of schools. So it was schools that were selected for urban, rural, suburban, and different socioeconomic backgrounds. So when they disaggregated by schools, that was an effort to get slightly more contextualized than lumping the whole sample together. And passive because students were data to be drawn upon. They weren't characterized as playing a role of curriculum unfolding, and their voices weren't consulted. This study, a framework for assessing and nurturing young children's thinking and probability. This is a design study because the goal of the study was to develop a framework for how probabilistic thinking develops over time. And then principles for task design were constructed based on interviews with students. So students were represented directly, qualitative descriptions of their mathematical thinking. It was dynamic because there were multiple rounds of students thinking collected over 3 points in time because the goal was to look at how probabilistic thinking develops. This was a process study because it was about designing curriculum, learning goals for students, principles for instructional tasks. Students were constructed in a generalized manner because the population of the school was described very generally, but no information about who the participants were specifically was provided. More passive because, again, students were data to be drawn upon rather than in-the-moment transformations happening in that way. So this was an article that I wrote, and this was related to the mathematical transitions project I described earlier. And this was an article where we interviewed students over 2.5 years from moving from connected mathematics into high school that had a more procedural approach to teaching and learning. And we looked at what we considered to be 2 types of learning that students experienced from making sense out of a range of curriculum experiences, both about their learning about their identities, who they were as learners, about their preferred learning practices. From the opportunity to compare and contrast different opportunities to learn, they were able to have a stronger sense of their preferred learning practices. And their opportunity to learn about the nature of mathematics, it broadened. What counted as learning and doing math was broadened for them by experiencing a range of opportunities to learn. And so we're characterizing that as learning because they were making sense out of these different experiences that they had. So students were constructed as outcomes because it's looking at what happens when students experience these range of curriculum approaches. But this was an alternative outcome to collecting achievement data. Dynamic, because this is over 2.5 years of time. Generalized, we actually didn't say very much about who the students were and their histories other than their histories with curriculum materials. Active, because students' voices about their experiences were privileged in this work, so they were given a say in evaluating their curriculum experiences. This is an article by Dan Chazen, Algebra for All Students. So the goal of this article was to reflect upon the construct of algebra for all and its policy applications. But then he also then looked at a case of a teacher teaching Algebra 1 in a lower track class, and he worked really closely with that teacher. So this was a process study that both looked at what students should learn, learning goals, and how teachers use the opportunities, the curriculum materials that they developed at that school. Dynamic, because data collection took place over a year and showed some evolution in students thinking about mathematics and evolution in their engagement in Algebra 1 class. Contextualized, because there was a detailed portrayal of the participants' histories and lives and communities that they lived in. Active, because their students' voices were a big part of a section of the article. So the researcher worked very closely with the teacher. They interviewed some students who were not participating as actively in their Algebra 1 classroom. The students expressed that they were not participating because sometimes the class moved too quickly. And I'm having trouble figuring out how to get the floor, and so what's the point anyway? And the researcher and the teacher both pushed back on the student and said, the students who said that and said, if you don't share your ideas, other students won't have an opportunity to learn from you. And that affected both how the students engaged in the future and how the teacher made an effort to bring them into the classroom. So this was an active space where both their voices were shared and information about how the teacher and the students responded together to change the interaction patterns in the classroom. So as I mentioned, the real purpose of this literature review has been to uncover a range of constructions that seem to take place in this subset of research. It's still useful to look at the prevalence of how often these constructions have taken place in the articles that I analyzed. So first, let's look at how students have been represented in this group of articles, of 64 articles wherein students are represented directly, and the goals of these articles. Students could be represented in more than one way in the same article, and so we could see that I thought there would be, based on my conjecture, we could say I thought there would be a lot of quantitative representations of students, but there's actually more of qualitative descriptions of students' mathematical thinking, but still not that much here. There's their voices. The goal of the article, again, my beginning conjecture would be that there was more here, evaluating the efficacy, but there's actually more design, but there could be more than one goal in the same article as well. Regarding constructions of students, I conjectured there would be more in outcome, and there's still quite a lot. And there could be articles that could be both outcome and process, but process ended up being more prevalent in this subset of articles. There were more constructions of students, slightly more, as dynamic, and that was higher than I expected. I thought there would be more static constructions. There are more constructions of students as a generalized student, not as many as contextualized student. And there are more constructions of students as passive rather than as active. So this was based on the articles that I looked at. So again, I'm trying to forward the contribution is what are some ways of constructing students, but this just gives you a flavor of how prevalent these constructions were in the articles that I looked at. Okay, so this last part of my talk is going to talk about the affordances of the different constructions and why do we care about the constructions at all. So I have a standpoint that leads me to value some of these constructions of students over others. I think that some are better or worth considering. But I want to acknowledge that all constructions of students have their own particular affordances and they align with particular goals. So constructing students as outcomes is valuable because we need evidence of efficacy. It's pretty complicated to connect curriculum to student learning because of so many mediating factors, but it's useful to look at data to help you make sense out of a situation. But constructing students in the process of curriculum design and use allows for understanding that interplay between curriculum and student learning and how students actually play a role in that process too. And both actually are important to see the interplay of curriculum and student learning to the conclusion, to the outcomes, to shed light on design and how teachers interact with materials and students concurrently. A static construction of students is good because we're capturing students at least one point in time. Dynamic constructions of students represent students as evolving, capturing change over time. Generalized constructions of students, sometimes it is useful to consider how a case of a student or group of students could be typical. And then contextualized constructions of students, this allows for considering to whom the data may or may not generalize. Passive constructions of students. So students may not always engage actively in the process when teachers are implementing materials, and they may not always play an active role in transforming the opportunities to learn, and students may not always have strong views about their experiences with curriculum, so at least they're accounted for by researchers somehow. And active constructions of students acknowledge students' agency, either through describing roles that they play in the relationship between curriculum and students' learning, and giving students agency by amplifying their voices. So why would I want to look at this in the first place? So I want to acknowledge what I think are 4 different ways that these constructions are contributions for us. Raising our awareness as researchers, illuminating relationships between curriculum and student learning, honoring the complexity of students' experiences, and considering for whom opportunities to learn could be beneficial. I think that these 4 dimensions raise awareness for us because it could help us see our perhaps unintentional choices, how that could impact how students are represented, constructed, thought about. And if we have options before us and think about these different dimensions, we might more purposefully choose a different choice if we're aware of choices that we could make. We might make an alternative choice on how we construct students if we're aware of different options before us. So some constructions of students, I think, go further to help us unpack relationships between curriculum and student learning. And as before, I said that both outcome and process constructions add to this. But dynamic constructions of students, they provide insights to gains and growth in students' learning over time. And active constructions of students are needed to really understand how those teacher-student interactions help transform opportunities to learn. So humanistic goals, honoring the complexity of students' experiences. I believe passionately that students are more than data points and test scores. I think that having a humanistic goal is important to honor students as people. So dynamic constructions of students, this acknowledges that students are evolving, changing people. Whenever we get a static construction of anyone, it's just who you are in a particular moment on a particular day. Contextualized constructions of students acknowledge that research participants are individuals. They are people with histories and significant out-of-school and in-school experiences. And these experiences can shed insight to how they think mathematically and what they're learning about math. And active constructions attribute agency to learners. Learners have agency. It's how active they are in their environment to try to understand who they are. And it's just a part of honoring our participants as people. Certain constructions of students provide more insights for working toward equity. Dynamic constructions of learners that emphasize growth, this provides us an opportunity to look for improvements in contrast to perhaps focusing on deficits between groups. Contextualized constructions of students allow us to see students as individuals rather than as representatives of their school, something like that, or groups. So to work toward equity, we need to consider for whom opportunities to learn have and have not been beneficial, but in a careful, contextualized manner that doesn't essentialize students. So as I mentioned, this work is in progress, and I'm into my last phase, and I'm ready to submit this back to a journal. I submitted it about a year ago, and I got major feedback, and that's why I've ended up with additional constructions of students, and I have a fifth one. The last time I presented this work in public, someone said to me, what about constructing students as thinkers versus people who feel and experience? So I made progress through analyzing the 64 articles and haven't completed it all, but it looks like about 25% are right around something other than thinkers or in addition to thinkers, and most of them construct students as thinkers. I'm looking for profiles or clusters of constructions of students. Are there certain types of constructions that seem to go together within a research article? I've experimented with looking at trends over time. For example, like groups over 5 years. I'm not seeing significant trends yet, but maybe I haven't broken it down at the right increments. There does appear to be a time where design-based research tends to come up more, but other than that, it's hard to see. Efficacy studies seem to be prevalent over time. It's hard to see, so I'm still exploring that. I've looked at studies set in the United States, contrasted with studies set in other nations. Studies set in the United States tend to have more efficacy studies, but other types of studies are in the US as well. So I'm playing with which of these features to include in the final write-up. I think this one will make it in. I'm less sure about these two. So a takeaway idea that I'd like to leave you with is that I've been conducting this work in an effort to understand what a nuanced look at students in research on curriculum could look like. Over the past 2 decades, there's been attention to teachers in research on curriculum in more nuanced ways and looking at ways that teachers play a role in the relationship between curriculum and students' learning. And I think we need to take a complementary, more nuanced look at students and the relationship between curriculum and students' learning as well. But when I conducted my systematic analysis, I did see that there was more sophisticated representations of students that I conjectured, but I think we also have a distance yet to go as a field. So thank you. So I would be very open to having conversation. I haven't submitted the article yet, back to the journal yet. So help me.
So does anyone have any questions?
So I'm curious about the dynamic view of students. To me, pre-post seems very different from sort of over time following students. Can you talk a little bit about, have you broken that out at all? Or?
So that's an interesting question. Within dynamic, there's a lot collapsed in that category like you're noticing. In a way, I considered even including pre-post as an advance over a single point in time. So right now that's pretty binary. It's either static or dynamic, but you can go within dynamic and break it out further, more and less dynamic. So I haven't done that yet, and that's an interesting question. And how dynamic do we need to get to say that it's actually dynamic? But I did think that having a gain score or a change over time was something, but I haven't broken it out. And that was actually not as high of a reliability rating as I thought, and I was sort of surprised by that. And I think it's because sometimes when you're looking at the implementation studies, how much time needs to pass for it to be dynamic. So if I looked at 3 lessons in a row within a unit, is that enough period of time to pass to be a change over time, or is that more really just a snapshot at one point in time? So that's a complexity in the definition and the way of thinking about that, but also like in our hearts, what feels like enough change. So I think it's complicated.
It seems like a very complicated category.
Yeah, I think I was trying to speak to anything different than looking at one snapshot in time, but it would be possible to break out dynamic further.
Okay, did you look at the differences by journal? Because I know that journals have very different choices in what they publish. For example, if you did further learning of mathematics, you would probably never see a quantitative article.
I did look at the differences by journal. How do I report it? So this number 4 is kind of a proxy for that, right? Because ESM and MTL, right? They're right. So and then JMB was added. I've been working on this for years, and the first time I did it, I'll work on this paper, and then I'll write some other papers and actually publish them, and then work on this paper some more. And right, okay. Jeremy is the one with the most efficacy studies, but Jeremy also has other types, right? And MCL tended to have more design-based work. So I have done that analysis by journal, but I don't quite know what to make of it, right? And so what are your thoughts on that? Right, I don't have FLM. That's been offered to me as another one to think about. So.
Exactly. So I asked that question because to me the quantitative percentage you received is high. You said it was low. I thought it was high based on the other studies.
Lower than I expected.
Right.
But not.
Exactly. And I thought it was higher than what I expected based on the other study, which someone in this room actually did recently. It was one of yours, Dr. Kilpatrick.
Sure.
So yeah, so I'm worried that the major choice of sampling here has affected your results.
Well, sure, and this is why it will always, right? Like
Yeah.
how I sample my articles will affect, and that's why I've been trying to say that really I think the outcome here of this work is conceptual. What are some ways to think about and characterize and construct students? Because I could sample in different ways, like from the journal or a different period in time or include different journals. And ultimately at the end of the day, I don't want to say this journal good, this journal bad, because clearly I have preferences for how we should think about how students are constructed. And I don't really want to say one construction is good and another construction is bad, but these constructions raise awareness for us, and are we constructing students in ways that we want to, and will these different constructions allow us to see something new?
And given your goal, I think you want to stress numbers less, because if you publish numbers like this, I suspect that people will use them. That would be my suggestion. Yeah, yep, a lot, yeah.
It's tricky because if I don't say the numbers at all, people want to know them.
Right.
Yeah.
Given the time frame that the world started in 1990, of course.
No. I just didn't want to analyze 300 articles.
That's a common view held in this room, by the way.
Okay. I don't believe that,
Except
but
for a couple of old people.
I don't believe that.
I just want to report that I was in a doctoral committee meeting with him last week where he complained that the literature review was too old. But that was a
Well,
counterpoint.
actually, my question is about, given the data you have, the construction of the students that occurs in curriculum research and mathematics education seems to me to have been impacted pretty greatly by the changes in technology over this same period of time. And I didn't hear anything about that as a factor in the reviews you've done.
Do you mean technology in the kind of research that we conduct, or technology in how teaching and learning can take place in classrooms?
The latter.
The latter.
The world has changed.
Right. That's an interesting question. So what I was looking at is how we as researchers talk about students in our work.
Yeah, well, we ignore that the technology is there a lot of the times, but it's, I think it's kind of putting our head in the sand. There's something going on out there. Kids have their pads and their cell phones, and it's a different world for them.
I think that technology could allow for capturing more dynamic data points, for instance, even within a lesson, right? So a simple example might be maybe clickers. You could have a lot of different data points within that lesson of how someone's thinking evolves over a shorter period of time, right? So I can only account for, in my analysis, what researchers account for in their work, right? So it's a tension there, but that's an interesting point to think about. And I wonder, maybe there are ways that I could look at active engagement, the active construction with actively engaging with what, right? With each other, with the teacher, with the students, with technology. There's ways that could be broken down further too.
Jamie. I was just curious if you could talk about where you were. So I heard, you said a little bit about this thinking, feeling, experiencing, and then the outcome process dimensions. Can you talk about where the other dimensions emerged from? How you came up with them?
That's a great question. So I'll just be open and say the very first time I talked about this project was in 2011 at PMENA, and Amy Parks was at that talk, and other folks. Then I wrote a paper and I submitted it. And so that very first version of the project was breaking out outcomes and various processes that students could be involved in. And then I did a whole analysis of all of these articles and looked at different ways students were represented in processes and outcomes, wrote it up, and had people read it. And it was through people reading it that I think Amy and Beth Herbal-Eisenman at Michigan State pushed on this notion of generalized versus contextualized, other people reading it, right? Talking to other people, sharing the work, giving me ways to think about it, thinking versus feeling, experiencing. In December, I shared this work at Rutgers University, and Jerry Golden and Dan Beatty independently in different conversations pushed me on this, and I'm collaborating with Jerry Golden and Jim Middleton on a chapter for the third handbook that's coming out that's about student engagement. So I shouldn't have been surprised, given who I was talking to, that they said you could just cut the data this way and look at it that way. So it's through a lot of conversation and dialogues that I've even come to understand more what it means to construct a participant anyway. And then through conversations of what does it mean to construct a participant, that's where these different ways of comparing and contrasting have come out. So through sharing it at conferences, sharing it at talks, writing, having people read, sending it to a journal, getting feedback from the reviewers. So now it's a fundamentally different paper with clearer constructions that I had in the past and clearer definitions. So yeah, that's a short version of the process. And I promise you, I've been publishing other pieces rather than just only working on this for a period of years. But some pieces are like this, right? Some pieces you keep returning to, like a labor of love that you're passionate about. And other pieces you also love, but they come to be through a different process that maybe doesn't take as many iterations in the same manner. And that's okay, because they each have their own lives. And this one has a long life. But I also think it's because it's really complicated. And it's not something that we talk about all the time. So I think it's been worth spending this much time thinking about. I'll go back to it. I'll work on something else and I go back to it. I'm almost ready to send it back. Amy.
Hey, and I want to say I loved seeing how this has developed over those 2 years.
Thank you for being
Which
patient
isn't
with
that
me.
long.
Right.
And I also want to start by saying one of the things I just love about you as a person and as a researcher is how generous you are. Generous with other researchers, generous with diverse traditions, generous with diverse methodologies. I really value that.
Thank you. I'm trying to honor that other people might have goals that are different than mine, right?
You do, and you
Okay.
do, I think, almost a better job of that than maybe anyone out there right now. So I'm going to give you that. But I'm also then going to push you and say, you've talked about the affordances of each of these constructions, but I'm wondering if you've also thought about the dangers of particular constructions and the kind of damage that might be being done by particular constructions, and looking at it what stands out to you as sort of the third whale. Yes, all of these things have affordances, but I'm really worried about what's happening around this kind of thing.
Yeah, because in a way, if we acknowledge affordances, it gives us that space where we can say, but then what? What do other people think about that? So I think that it is dangerous to talk about students in a relatively generalized way. Because then people draw conclusions that may not be fair, they may make connections that aren't clear, and they may assume that people are, or more importantly are not, capable of doing certain things that they are capable of doing. So that's one step in that direction. So that's a fair push. I need to spend more time thinking about it. Do you have reactions to that?
I mean, I think what you point out is really true. I also think this notion of students as passive is really important, because you said, well, students might not always have strong opinions. But it seems to me whether they do or don't have strong opinions, they're still actively involved in constructing that curricular space. If all I do is keep my eyes down and not engage with the teacher over this, that's still an active construction of what's happening in the classroom. Shrugging and saying, I don't care to interview questions is an active, going down and bubbling all threes on one of those surveys is an active choice.
Right,
So
an
it
active
seems
choice
even
to
allowing
disengage,
students to
right.
be read as passive discounts something about what it is to be a person.
Yes. Yes. That's really, I agree with that, and that's helpful. And I think I use passive and active in different ways in the talk, and I could be more consistent with how I use that language too. Because one way I was thinking about passive is I interview you, right? And then I use that data to construct goals for what people should learn and how they think about math. But I could also interview you to kind of get advice and get insights and get some new ideas for how curriculum could be developed and how teaching and learning could be transformed. So that's a way that interview data could be constructed by a researcher in a more passive, I'm using it, I'm drawing on it, or active, like I'm involving you in this activity. But passive and active could be, I look at you and you're a student in this classroom and I see you as being passive, but that's actually an active construction of curriculum because you're not passive, you're engaging in a different way, right? So, yeah, that's useful.
So is it possible to do a large-scale efficacy study valuing the things that you value? Or is this more of a quant-qual sort of split?
Right. Andy Norton also asked me that question when I was at PMENA this year. I shared this idea with the working groups, and I think it is. For example, in the mathematical transitions project work I looked at, I'm telling you about one site, but we actually had over 100 kids across 4 sites. And so the 2008 piece in Jeremy that John Starr is the lead author, Jack Smith and myself wrote, looks at how students talk about the differences between different curricular approaches. So that's a larger scale qual-ish piece. So that's one piece. I think it would be harder to look at the dynamics of how curriculum evolves over time in larger scale work, but there's efficacy studies that do look at teachers' implementation of curriculum materials, and they don't necessarily always carefully account for students in how teachers implement the curriculum materials, however. So I think one contrast is that the larger scale work could account for different outcomes that are typically accounted for. It's harder to do qualitative work with larger amounts of students, but it's still possible. So yeah, there are some things to think about there. Yes, Nick.
Can you, how are you operationalizing this fifth construction? Like, what evidence are you looking for thinking? What evidence are you looking for feeling, experiencing, and how are you sort of distinguishing the two?
So, for instance, if it's a study that includes a Likert scale, like self-efficacy, dispositional data of any kind, that could be in the realm of thinking or experiencing. It doesn't have to be just qualitative data. So anything that is something like a typical motivational, attitudinal outcome, or anything that's interviews of student voice, anything like that. Thinking would be test scores about mathematics, achievement, performance of some sort, or interviews with students about how they're thinking about solving a math problem. Those could be tricky because as I'm solving a math problem, right, I could be talking to you about my solution and then saying things like, oh, but I'm not sure, which is affective, but the researcher may not be analyzing that part. So it's the parts of that talk that the researcher is analyzing in that study. So does that help?
Other questions? You probably have time for one more.
Do you have a hypothesis about number 4, given that many other countries have a national curriculum, and often that also means national textbooks? It doesn't always.
My hypothesis about number 4 currently is a lot of grant proposals that we write asks for student learning outcomes as a part of the study. So I think a lot of the US funded studies, you're more likely to get funding if you also have student outcome data, so then publish it too. And a lot of the NSF funded curriculum materials, NSF wanted to get student learning data. So I think I'm conjecturing, I don't know how to explore this conjecture, but I'm conjecturing it might be a function of how our research is funded in the US, but I don't know enough about how research is funded elsewhere, and if you have thoughts and insights about that, I'm open. Do you have reactions to that idea?
Well, I certainly don't know lots of other countries, but Singapore, for example, is a lot of people think that the curriculum in Singapore means that there's one textbook series, and there's not. There's actually multiple textbook series in Singapore. But the Singapore government has an awful lot of control over everything, including who gets into teacher ed and what studies get funded. Virtually their only source for funding is the government, and so the people at the National Institute of Education do whatever studies the government funds, which you would presume, if they were funding curriculum studies, would be about at least the standards the government has put forward. So,
And there were studies from other countries like China that had student efficacy data, so it wasn't as if this was absent in other nations. It may be the proliferation of diverse options of curriculum materials in the US that lead to some of this as well. And so it's not that studies set in other nations didn't have efficacy studies. They had a range of more prevalence of other types of studies in addition to that. Maybe it's the proliferation of the range of different materials in the US that people are trying to sort through. Maybe, I don't know, are there fewer options in other nations? Great questions.
All right. Does anyone have any final thoughts? Comments?
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. So this article is going to have the longest acknowledgements list of all time. So many people have given me good things to think about. It's going to be an appendix. Infinite help possible. Work occurs in community, and so thank you for talking with me today.